Chapter 3, Section 5, Strong Rulers Unite China. The big question for this section, how did powerful emperors unite much of China and bring about a golden age of achievement? So by the end of the chapter, how Shi Huangdi unified China, how Han rulers strengthened the economy and government, why the Han period is considered a golden age of China, and why many Chinese people accepted Buddhist teachings. So when we look at Shi Huangdi, legalism is another kind of idea that's going to grow out of China. And what legalists believe is that people, by our own human nature, tend to not be very good people. We tend to be evil, we tend to be greedy, we're selfish, we focus on ourselves. And so their answer to that evil nature of humans is to have very strict laws and harsh punishment. And so what you see in that picture is someone being tortured or punished for committing one of their crimes. The other thing that they liked doing is they liked disfiguring people, cutting off people's noses, cutting off people's ears. And that was a physical reminder of what happens when you don't follow the laws. And so their belief is when you combine these two things, you are going to have order because people are going to be terrified to do anything wrong. So strength is the key trait. The other thing is because they don't want people thinking, they just want people obeying, they would burn books. They would burn Confucian books. They would burn poetry. Really the only thing that was allowed were books that served some kind of a function. So for example, books about agriculture, how to grow things, those were allowed. But books that contained ideas or thoughts or encouraged people to express free will, those things were destroyed. So how does Shi Huangdi unify China? He's going to do a couple of different things. One is he's going to rearrange China into 36 military districts, and he's going to put loyal officials in charge of each of those districts, and he's going to use his military to maintain control. Anybody who can really be a big threat to him, for example, these larger land-owning nobles, he forced them to leave their homes and move to the capital city for a couple of reasons. One, that allowed him to kind of keep his eye on them and watch over them and make sure they're not causing any problems. And then the second thing he would do is he would divide that land up and give it to the peasants of the region. So really these nobles kind of lost whatever wealth and power they had. And these new peasants would be loyal to Shi Huangdi, not the local noble. Now the other thing that he did is he also made sure that China had unified weights and measurements, a unified monetary system, and writing. The other thing he did is to try and make things better in terms of trade. He built more roads, he built more canals, and he passed a law that all the axles on wagons and carts had to be the same distance apart, so that way you had these ruts that wagons could go on, and they were all a uniform system. Now what this picture shows is Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, who visited Shi Huangdi's tomb, and I just think it's a crazy picture to see the two of them standing there, and these terracotta soldiers are as tall as President Reagan and his wife. Now the other thing too is each of these individuals are all different. So members of Shi Huangdi's army had to stand there and pose, and then their faces would get recreated in that tomb. So how else does Shi Huangdi unify China? One of the problems that they're running into is invaders from the north. And so he's not going to construct the Great Wall because the wall had already been kind of built. But for the most part, he's the one that's going to kind of finish it. There's going to be some more that's getting added on. But there's a series of walls that had already been built. And he's going to extend walls to join all the other ones together. He's going to rebuild those that need to be rebuilt. Now for the Chinese, they refer to this wall as the Long Graveyard because they had to drive people to exhaustion to build this wall. The other thing it was referred to as the Wall of 10,000 Souls, that so many people had died building this wall that got buried into it. And so it wasn't remembered fondly by the Chinese people. Eventually, the Qin dynasty is going to it collapsed shortly after Shi Hongdi because of all the taxes that he had to place on people to pay for all the stuff that he's doing, the forced labor to build the wall and some other things, and just the overall cruelty leads people not to want to have this dynasty hang around for very much longer. So when he's gone, it's going to be replaced by the Han Dynasty. One of the most famous Han emperors is Wu Di. What he's going to do is he's going to have universities around China that are going to train people to work in the government, and they are going to be trained in the teachings and the ideas of Confucius. They're going to continue adding canals and roads to China to help trade and commerce and transportation. The other thing that they're going to do is they're going to build granaries throughout China. And what they're going to do is the government is going to buy grain when there's a surplus. And what that'll do is a couple of things. One is it'll keep the price of grain steady. They'll hold on to that surplus. And then when there is some kind of a natural disaster or poor years, then they will sell that grain so that way people have access to it and prices won't go too high. Also, they took control of two key industries, iron and salt, that all people need, and the government's going to take over and control it so that way they can maintain a fair price and all people can afford iron tools and also salt, which is necessary for living. It's also during this time that the Great Silk Road is going to link China to the West. And this is going to bring new foods and products from the West into China. It's also going to enable China to export its silk all over the world. And this is going to become not just a major trade route, but a major connection between East and West. And so that there's going to be this cultural diffusion and sharing that's going to take place. So I already mentioned this a little bit, that these scholars, these government workers, are going to be trained in the teachings of Confucius. Now, in order to make sure that they're having the best people working in the government, they adopt a civil service system and exam. So you have to work extremely hard, study, demonstrate you understand Confucius and the way that the government should work. You take a very difficult exam, and if you pass that exam, you get to become a government worker. And this civil service exam and the civil service system is going to exist in China pretty much nonstop until 1912. And so what that means is that Confucius and his ideas are going to have a big impact on China all the way up until almost just 100 years ago. And it still has an impact today. So why is the Han Dynasty considered to be a golden age? Well, there's all kinds of really cool things going on. You've got astronomers who are creating very accurate calendars and timekeeping. They invented a thing that could allow them to predict, I guess, not necessarily predict, but detect is the word I'm looking for. Detect earthquakes all over China. And so what you see down here is you see all of these little dragons and these little frogs or whatever underneath. And each of these dragons had a metal ball in. And so if there's an earthquake in this part of China, then that ball would drop into the frog. If it happened in this part of China, it would drop into that frog. So they knew when an earthquake had happened and where it had happened at. So when we look at some of the other things that they did in terms of engineering, they're creating paper, ships that are huge and capable of being able to go across the Pacific Ocean if they needed, suspension bridges. In terms of art, poetry is big, they're writing books, and their artisans are very technically advanced. So what's going to happen to help the spread of Buddhism? In times of crisis, what you see is that people want to find an escape from all their misery, and they want to find an easy, simple way to reach salvation. And Buddhism provides that. And what happens in China is that these Buddhist ideas are going to kind of bring in ideas from Confucius and Taoism, and they're going to merge and kind of form its own unique brand of Buddhism, I guess. So looking ahead, what we're going to have is a united China that's going to last on and off for the next several thousand years. You're going to have a system of government administration that's going to last all the way throughout until 1912. And Confucian ideas are going to play a pretty important role in Chinese history.